back to another Daily Walk. Well, today I want to talk a little bit about a report that came out of Brigham Young University and Harvard. I know two leading schools on Christian evangelical scholarship. But it was actually an interesting report, about 40 pages long. You can download it, and it is called Faith in Educational Renewal. And what it showed is that students that came from faith-based backgrounds, and they were very generic about what that would specifically mean, tended to perform much better than students who did not. And so I wanted to chat a little bit about this particular report, and I had listed down 4 reasons why I think this is probably the case. And being that their definitions weren't specifically church as much as religious involvement, I don't think it's specifically learning about God. Although the closest to it we get is many different religious traditions will teach principles of morality. And obviously that is certainly something that is important. Now, why do we cover this in something like this? Well, it just talks kind of about the importance of church in general as an institution, if not necessarily as a place to grow in your faith in Christ. But it's always important to look at things like this. And this was yet one more report that came out. A number of reports came out recently showing that somewhere around 2010, there was a cognitive decline in people. And for the first time ever, the students now in the younger generation are less cognitively able than their parents. And I actually been talking about this for a number of years because I was a college professor right at where that inflection point was, and that was around 2010. And I had said that the reason I think that happened is there was a trifecta that impacted society. Around 2010, mobile phones and mobile tablets, the little handheld computing devices, became mainstreamed. Now, while they were released a little bit before this, they were mainstreamed around 2010, where the average person could go into a store and buy an average device. And so whether that was a really good one or kind of a craplet, we used to call them, the really low quality Android tablets, we call those craplets, you could get at least something. The second factor is the proliferation of high-speed internet and always connected internet. You have to understand, if you're young, there was a day before that we would have to come home at night, we'd have to turn on our modem, it'd go and all this, and then it'd connect, and you'd have a 33.5 kilobit per second internet connection, which was painful enough downloading emails. And if you wanted to do anything beyond emails, I hope you have patience. So starting around 2010, first thing we got was DSL and cable internet were becoming mainstream to the point where the average person could actually afford them. And then they actually had internet speeds that were fast enough. Now, by fast, high-speed internet, we're talking 3G, which is laughably slow in today's standards, but that was wicked, crazy, wild fast back in that day. And because websites took infinite amounts less data than they do now, the internet was actually very reasonable under 3G speeds. But 3G internet through your phone connection or through your DSL or cable connections brought the internet home, and this was about the era when people's internets were always on. You had a separate line for the internet. You didn't have to dial into the internet from a specific computer. We had the proliferation of the routers and the networks that were always on in the house, so you just had to plug the computer into the network. And then the third part was social media. Social media, obviously MySpace was around a little bit before that. Facebook launched up in the, was it like 2008-ish, around there, but it was exclusive to Harvard. And then it branched out to a few different campuses before finally going mainstream. Wasn't around 2010-ish or so. Right around that time, we got the proliferation of social media. You had Facebook, you had Twitter, a number of other smaller ones came and went in that time as well. But what happened in that 2010 trifecta is now people had really fast, always on internet on a little handheld computer that was reasonably affordable and a social network to distract them from everything around. And as a college professor, I watched people from before that era until into that era and a little bit after that era. I watched people go from sitting in hallways studying or sitting at the lounges talking to friends to everybody isolating themselves on a phone, distracting themselves instead of learning, and sitting there in isolation rather than hanging out in groups. And we mentioned all of this. The report didn't specifically say this, but when you actually looked at the reports and the testing standards, you actually see every measure they have an inflection point at that exact point in time. It's very interesting. That was the highest scoring averages was right around that time, and since then all of these have declined. Now, the report showed that anybody involved in religious traditions, they tended to have about, I think it was like was it a 0.144 GPA higher? It was a significant number versus people that did not have the religious traditions, and they found that the middle class was more impacted than the poor. Universally scored more poorly, and the wealthier generally scored a little bit higher, not seriously impacted, probably because of, in some instances, better schools, or hey, what my first theory is why this is happening is reduced reduced screen time. More time without screens. If you're going into a church service, hopefully you're doing it without a phone. If you're going into a youth group or some other Awana for your younger kids, you're going into these circumstances, you have more time where you're connecting to other people and you're not staring at a screen. And I think that real difference shows that cognitive ability. On our Switch to Linux channel, we talked about a report that came out last week that showed, or it came out last year. It went viral again last week. Some rich dude tweeted it or something. But the report came out last year, and it showed that just taking 1 week, I think it was 2 weeks off of your smartphone, like cut data from your smartphone for 2 weeks, and your brain will de-age itself 10 years. Cognitive ability will drastically increase. Mental health markers drastically improve. It is a tremendous thing that happens when you stop staring at screens. And that was what was interesting in this faith report here, is that 2010 area, I think it showed up around 2013 because of the way testing is delayed, then those we saw those same exact inflection points. And so I think that people involved in some form of faith tradition are going to spend a slightly less time with screens, indicating a slightly better GPA and other scoring habits. Now, the next point that the first point that they addressed, one of their suggestions, is moral teaching. Now, we can disagree on a number of different principles of faith, but most of us agree that some moral root, whatever that happens to be, tends to be at the center of most forms of religious teaching. Obviously, in Christianity, we would teach that your moral compass would come from the immutable character of God, and that the way that we look at the world should be through the reflection of God as He taught us in the Scriptures. And there's different interpretations of that in different faith centers and things like that. But every case, the moral standards of most religions generally agree on just the pure moral principle, outside of how does one get to heaven, what qualifies as a sin, but the basic moral principles of generally do good to people, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. This is a general principle found in most different religions. And it just turns out that people who follow those types of moral codes, they tend to have less conflict going on in their life in general. Now, that brings me to my third point that I didn't see in the report. And I skimmed the report. I didn't read all 40 pages in close detail. But I did skim through it looking for their conclusions and what they thought. This is one that I concerned, and the reason I came up with this is Neil Goleman? No. Something Goleman. Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence, was an excellent book on this principle, where He talks in that book about the importance of emotional IQ, but sometimes it's masked by other issues and problems. So he says in there, you know, a kid from a poor home who doesn't know if he's going to eat tonight doesn't really care what 2 plus 2 equals. And so no amount of deeper education is going to help resolve that kid's problems and solve his academic issues, because the core of his academic issues are the fact that he just doesn't have the basics of his life taken care of yet. And so moving on to something as trivial as math just is not as important to him. And that's an important principle. Those who attend church, particularly in the Christian church, I'll say, those who attend church, particularly in the Christian churches, they have a center that their faith is something that will alleviate the pressure of their needs. You know, a person who has no background in God, no idea that he could be there, doesn't have any higher power to rely on and rest their troubles on and rest their cares on. Whereas people who go to church, they have, at least to some degree, they have a reliance on God. They recognize He's there. They recognize God is in control. And so they are not as much under pressure. And so students will perform better academically if they have an idea that things are going to go well for them. And so I think that the going into a church will help in those particular circumstances. And then the fourth thing I want to mention here, and this was one of the ones that they had mentioned in their report, was the social. Now, they mentioned just the social structure aspect of it. What I likewise want to mention as part of the social pressure is the positive peer pressure that can come with churches. By and large, kids who hang out with other kids from church tend to have a little bit more temperament to their sin, we should say. They're not as inclined to give wrong peer pressure in different ways. So they're less inclined to fall into traps, which will then lead to further problems, which will then lead to a declined academic performance. So an increase of a social structure of a church or a youth group or some other system, and combined with the positive peer pressure, will lead itself naturally to having a better overall performance academically. And so that is a lot of a different type of approach we usually take on this channel, but I thought it was a fascinating report to read. And if you were just looking for one other reason to keep your kids involved in some type of program, even if the program's not necessarily the best, you know, it might very well be better than them doing whatever that may or may not actually have any other positive impact. So let me know your thoughts about all that in the comments down below. Do you notice the kids doing better in your life if they are involved in church events? Let me know your thoughts about all that in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and hope that you enjoy your daily walk in our Lord.